Hello, my name is Claire, and I'm going to be talking about how we integrated our Ember app into native iOS and Android apps. So the task was to create native apps for the AHR, but given that we already had a relatively large Ember app, we obviously didn't want to rebuild everything from scratch. We wanted to reuse what we already built for the web, and so we decided to take the hybrid approach. So we still built a few parts of the app natively, things like the login screen, the lock screen, and the main navigation menu. And then for the rest of the app, we decided that it would be best to load it dynamically in a web view, as opposed to packaging it up with the rest of the app. And this is mostly because we didn't want to have to resubmit to the App Store every time we wanted to update the Ember app. And this way we get updates for free every time you log in. So then the question is, how do we communicate between the two parts of the app? So let's just look at it, the app. It's not really a demo, it's actually a video, but just to give you some context, and then we'll go back and answer that question. Okay, so this is the login screen for iOS, and this is all native, but at this point the Ember app is also loading in the background in a web view. So by the time you go through this login and two-factor authentication step, the Ember app is almost fully loaded. So once you're logged in, the whole right-hand side is the Ember app in a web view, and the only native part is the navigation menu on the left. And so the Ember app just behaves as it normally does when you access it through a browser. The lock screens are native, so this pin code or password unlock. And then if you log out, you just go back to the native screen, native login screen. So how are they communicating with each other? So for the first step in bridging the gap, we decided to use an Ember service to act as a facade to the main app. So even though in practice, because we're not on Ember CLI yet, you could still access app as a global, we didn't really want to do that. We wanted to provide a simplified interface by creating a facade object that just exposes the stuff that we need in order to interact with the native screens. So within the Ember app, we start off by extending Ember service to create a new service, and then we get an instance of that object and attach it to the global namespace so that we can subsequently access it from the native code. And moving to the native app, the next thing we need to do is set up handlers in order to make and receive JavaScript calls to this object. So for iOS, the basic gist is that we're loading the web app within the WK WebView class, and that gives us this evaluate JavaScript method that we can call on the web view and call the native bridge functions. And then to receive calls, we can add a named script message handler to the view controller, which actually adds another global object under the name WebKit message handlers and your named event that you can then post messages to with JavaScript. And then Android has a pretty similar API, and it has some links at the end for more in-depth examples of both of those. So meanwhile, back in our Ember app, in the native bridge, we need to allow native bridge to send calls to those handlers. So we set up this generic send native event function, and that takes in the event name and event args with more information about the event that you're sending. And then we're basically just checking for the existence of those bridge objects that we set up previously in the native code. So, and then whichever one is present is the one that we send to, because it's obviously only ever going to be one of those present at one time. So it's pretty simple. And the nice thing about this is that if we wanted to add in support for another native platform, it would be pretty easy if it had a similar JavaScript API, because it would just be like adding another condition to this function. And this is really the only part of the native bridge service that is platform specific. The rest is just generic. all that's left is to build out all the interactions between Native and Ember. So all of the functionality that we saw before, like logging in, logging out, locking, unlocking, and navigating, um, we need to build out those functions in Native Bridge. So we'll just look at one example, which is navigation, because it's pretty straightforward. So when a user selects an item on the native menu, then we need to trigger a route transition within the web view. And vice versa, if a transition occurs within the web view, we need to, like independent of the menu, we need to let the native menu know where we are in the app so that it can highlight the correct menu item. And so when we implemented this, we actually used a custom routing service that we built. And the routing service is basically just a wrapper for the application router. And it allows us to inject routing capabilities into objects that otherwise don't have access to the router, like services and components. So the user selects something on the native menu, calls the navigate to route method, passing in the route name, and then Native Bridge then uses the routing service to trigger the transition. And on the flip side, we're subscribing to a router did transition event on the routing service, so that when a transition occurs, the routing service will notify us of the event, and then we can pass that event on to Native along with the current route name, and it can decide whether it needs to update the menu or not. So pretty straightforward. And in summary, we bridged the gap between Native and Ember using a simple Ember service as a facade, and that allowed us to create native apps without rebuilding everything, but still having some native features. And an added bonus is that the Ember app stays permanently up to date because it's loaded dynamically. And now that we have the native bridge pattern in place, it's relatively easy to add in support for other native platforms. And it's also pretty easy to extend to include support for interactions that we might add for other native features that we might want to build into the app later on. And some resources, obviously you can download the app, and there's some links to further information about those native JavaScript APIs. And that's it. You guys are free to go. And if you have questions, though, we're all going to be around.